Hello, puppies and kittens. One of the irritating arguments that I get like every day is this stupid notion that that coded information always comes from a mind, and therefore DNA is proof of God because DNA is assumed to be a code. And but while we could argue that there is an analogous interpretation of that, if we were to say that because of this analog in our understanding that we say that changes in the construct will produce different proteins or whatever, and then therefore, that changes that it codes for different proteins. If we use that kind of language and call it a code in that capacity, then DNA would be the exception to the rule because it obviously does not come from a mind, and there's no way that a mind could do that. Let's not forget that a disembodied mind is not something that is in the realm of possibility. We have to, you have to show me that that's possible first, and that's already insane. And then there's other things like let's just remember that how does this mind make things happen? Oh, it wills it to happen because telekinesis. No, telekinesis is not a thing either, and neither is magic. None of that is real. And it's important to realize it's not really that hard to figure out. Just look it up, right? A code is a system of words, letters, figures, or other symbols substituted for other words, letters, symbols, etc., especially for the purposes of secrecy. Now, words like especially, don't really apply in definitions. It has to be consistent all the time. But that's not what DNA is. DNA is not substituting, one word or one letter for another word or letter. We use these abbreviations for cytosine, thylacine, all that, but they're not letters, and codons are not words, and the genes are not sentences or paragraphs. It's not a language like that. And so I thought that probably the best way to explain that would be to get somebody on here that understood maybe computer technology well enough to understand the relationship between the way genetics actually functions and the way programming functions and such. And so I brought in Grayson. Grayson, welcome. Can you explain what is your cred, your level of understanding that you're going to bring to the table today?
Yeah. Hi, Arn. Thanks for having me. So I have a degree in biochemistry. I've worked in a structural biology lab, specifically kind of at the interplay between genetics and proteins, as well as a neuroscience lab. I have a YouTube channel called Based Theory, as in a well-based theory, or the opposite of a cringe theory. And I do general science communication there. I do debates against pseudoscientists like young earth creationists, flat earthers, climate change deniers. And like you, I have also heard this argument all the time. I think it's very much akin to, well, a painting requires a painter, so a code must require a coder. And I find it to be just a little semantic game that creationists and intelligent design proponents will play. I mean, if it just depends on your use of words. Like if you describe,
I've got an example for that, because I tell them, if
yeah,
I don't call it creation, because you're already assuming the
exactly.
conclusion, what if we call it reality? Does reality require a realtor?
Yeah, I think I was about to. I have a very similar response where, does a universe require a universer, or a cosmoser? So it's all about just what word choice they want to use. And it's just a semantic game that doesn't necessarily have to have any basis in reality. But I think that there's a lot of history about why we call the genetic code a code, because oftentimes creationists will say, how could you not think it's a code? It's literally in the name, genetic code. And that'll be the end of the argument. They don't look at what the definition of a code is. They don't think about, well, what are the implications if this genetic code is a literal code and not just analogous to a code? What are the implications? And I'm looking forward to unpacking that a bit more with you today.
Well, I'm eager to hear it. I understand you've already made some notes, and I don't have any questions for you. Just
Cool.
tell me what you got.
So I would definitely agree with your definition of code there. I would maybe extend it a little bit further to say, within the context of computer programming, a code is like a set of instructions that is executed by a machine. And in this instance, a genetic code is not that. The genetic code doesn't tell, it's not a complete set of instructions for what to do. It might be a passive information storage for some of the building blocks of proteins, but it doesn't tell the proteins, like, we need this protein here, we need this much of it, we need it to fold in this pattern. None of that information is in the genome. And for computer programming, oftentimes there will be logic gates, there will be if then else clauses. That's a key aspect of computer coding. But these if then clauses are entirely absent in the genome. You will not find any if then clauses when you look in the genome. And there are, within the cell, there are analogs for these logic gates, these if then else clauses that are occurring, but they're not in the genome. They're in the cytoplasm, they're in the membranes, they're in the biochemical interactions. Like, you might have a certain hormone or a certain chemical signal that is interacting with the membrane and requires a certain threshold to elicit a response and get a transcription factor to bind and start to express a certain gene. Well, none of that conditional logic is occurring in the genome. None of that is coded in. That code is simply the reality of biochemical interactions. So if you want to stretch the word code to incorporate all biochemical interactions, I mean, you've basically generalized yourself into complete meaninglessness. So that is a key difference that I see between computer programming code and actual genetic code on a DNA level. So we can get into unpacking that a little bit, but that would be the main distinction that I see. Like, instead of an active set of instructions, the DNA is a passive template. And obviously, a template does not require a templater.
Well, then that should probably be the next thing that we talk about, because where does the template come from? I've talked to a lot of believers who think that each individual animal, each individual species has an entire schematic that is unrelated to everybody else's schematic, and that they all needed to have it built up from scratch. They don't understand that you have like one original genome for one original, let's say, last universal common ancestor kind of species, and that subtle changes will occur invariably, even though the system doesn't want there to be changes. There are effectively controls in place that so that the number of changes should be minimized, but mutations do happen. There's a number of outside influences that will cause this or that variant to change. And when we have reproductive populations of many different individuals, and they're reproducing all the time, and there's subtle changes occurring all the time, you are going to invariably have subtle distinctions, so that one population becomes visibly two different ones. And then I often say, it becomes 4, and then 8, and 16, 32, 64, and so on, excepting for the ones that go extinct. And then when you look at the genome, you look at even the mechanics, like the micromechanics of how these enzymes and everything are working to copy, to produce these proteins and everything. When you look at the system and you compare that of certain animals to the way that it works for certain plants or certain microbes, you realize there's a commonality even there, such that the construct, there's something changed in the fashioning of the construct. And so there's a consistency throughout this entire lineage, and it's shared partially with this other lineage, and then not so much with this more ancient lineage. And all of this implies an evolutionary ancestry. So it never gives the indication that that some mind sat down and drew out this schematic, typed out of this ridiculous thing in COBOL or whatever. It just it just ain't like that at all.
Yeah, exactly. So to answer your question, where these things come from, they're inherited. I mean, you inherit a lot of different biochemistry from your parents that are not contained within the genome, like from the various compositions, hormone baths, various molecules, microfauna. You get a lot from your parents that are not contained within your genome. So yes, this speaks to evolution and inheritance and changing that template over time. And this sort of brings up sort of a corollary phenomenon here of certain scientists who will insist that DNA is a literal code. And their argument is just that these codes can evolve and do evolve. These do not require a coder. For example, Richard Dawkins is a pretty famous proponent of this idea. If you ask Richard Dawkins, is DNA a code? He'll say, yes, of course. And if you listen to the argument that he presents for why that is, like in my opinion, it is a truly terrible, terrible argument. So I'll present it to you and hear your take on it. So Richard Dawkins says that, of course, DNA is a code because you can literally translate a book into nucleic acids. Like you could translate the contents of a book, the informational contents of a book, into base pairs. And to me, you could do that with literally everything. I could take a leaf and say one leaf is an A, 26 leaves is a Z, and so therefore leaves are a code and trees are full of information that they're trying to convey to me. Like you could literally do this with every single thing. The bumps on a rock, you could make that, you could translate a book into bumps on a rock. And then you would say bumps on a rock are code. Like I don't know if Richard Dawkins has thought through this argument very much, but I find it entirely unconvincing. And this is his main argument whenever he's asked, is DNA a code?
I think what he's going for there is, yeah. Some people say that the information in one cell, in any one cell, contains so much information that it would be like, so many volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica and all of that, so to hold all of this information in this one tiny cell, because somehow they've got the idea that complexity implies a designer.
Yeah.
Which is another failure in the argument. What Dawkins was going for was, well, that may be, but if you convert it into binary, then you can put the entire human genome on a single CD.
Yeah. And we've seen complexity evolve. I mean, not even just through evolution. Complexity can arise from just like on-edge thermodynamic cases. Like we have actual like laws of physics for the arising of complexity. Even, Behe's famous irreducible complexity. We've seen systems that Behe's categorization of irreducibly complex would apply to. We've seen them evolve before our very eyes, historically and in the lab. So we know that evolution is capable of creating these very complex systems and complexifying them even further. So this is,
and it's important. It's important to throw this out there too. Is it like an intelligent designer? One of the hallmarks of an intelligent design would be an efficient simplicity. And what you get in biochemistry is quite the other way.
It's very noisy, very messy. Yeah.
It is obscenely, grotesquely complex, like way more complex. The complexity is so high and the efficiency conversely so low that this can only have been the result of a haphazard compilation, blind, without a plan in mind. Plan? They ain't no plan. So yeah. This is what you end up with, a convoluted mess. And so I remember when I was taking the upper level biology courses, and they go into like photosynthesis and other processes like that. I remember thinking that what intelligent designer would concoct such an absurdly convoluted Rube Goldberg system as this?
Yeah,
it's completely unnecessary, and it's all obviously incidental.
And I think that really ties in as well to the historical developments within molecular biology and about how this genetic code, as we call it today, came to be. Because initially, when the first, ideas about this genetic code were being formulated, there was no idea about what the actual biochemistry that was going on entailed. We had no idea about how ribosomes work or what transfer RNA was. Back in the 50s, right, when like Rosalind Franklin and Watson and Crick elucidated the structure of DNA, we knew that there were, 20 amino acids. There were 4 nucleic acids in DNA. So in the 50s, they thought there's got to be some kind of method from getting information from one to the other. And it was actually a physicist, George Gamow, who came up with the first sort of overall hypothesis for how this process could occur. And it's really, really interesting because the for George Gamow is most well known as being one of the early proponents of the Big Bang model and predicting the cosmic microwave background. So you mostly hear his name in cosmology. Very few people know the integral role that he played in the development of the genetic code and laying the groundwork for how generations of scientists after would think about the biochemistry that's going on here. So
if I'm understanding this correctly, they were using the word code before they knew, in fact, what it actually was.
Exactly. That is exactly the point. So there's actually a great quote about this from Francis Crick himself talking about Gamow's contribution, because in the 50s, Gamow was the first one. He called it the diamond code. And he came up with this idea. It's not accurate, but he came up with this idea for how you could get directly from the double helix of DNA to an amino acid sequence for proteins. Like there was no intermediary between them. It was just sort of direct. The amino acids fit into the little folds in the double helix structure. And it has this sort of diamond pattern. And so it's called the diamond code. And this is what Francis Crick said about it. He said that the importance of Gamow's work was that it was really an abstract theory of coding and was not cluttered up by a lot of unnecessary chemical details. So that was his quote about the contribution. So really the idea, the entire framework that Gamow approached this with was the idea that on one hand, you have one language of 4 nucleic acids in DNA and another language of 20 amino acids in proteins. And you need some sort of code that translates between these 2 languages. And that approach that Gamow initially took of just abstracting away from the actual real biochemistry that was going on onto this abstract generalized level, talking about codes and languages, which, you know, DNA is not a language. Amino acids and proteins are not a language. These things are only analogous to languages if you're stretching this analogy. And so it was this framework that all of the subsequent theory was following. Gamow sort of laid the groundwork in thinking about this whole process before we had any idea about how any of this actually worked. We had no idea how ribosomes worked. We didn't know what transfer RNA was. We didn't know anything about this process. And it was Gamow who started this RNA tie club, where there was, you know, a physicist started this biochemist club. You know, Watson and Crick were members, and there were only 20 members, 24. It was a very elite club, 20 for each amino acid and 4 for the nucleic bases. And you get your assigned tie, and that was it, 24 members. And these guys in the RNA tie club are responsible for a lot of the theories and the development of the very earliest era of molecular biology. So this really set the entire tone for subsequent work. And it wasn't until, like, you know, 1965 or so that we actually figured out how this was working with a mediator like transfer RNA. It's not like you're just reading and deciphering this genetic code. There's an actual physical interaction going on where, you know, you have the RNA, the 3 base pairs of a codon, and there's a physical interaction going on with the transfer RNA that's interacting purely through physical means. There's not a decipherment going on. It's just this shape fits this shape. The electrostatics work out and they interact. And because of the actual structure of the ribosome and the structure of transfer RNA, that's how you have this correspondence between a certain amino acid and a certain codon. This is not a code.
It's a decoder ring.
Yeah.
So the guy started with an analogy that he starts to think about this as a code. Yeah. He starts to analyze a decoder. That's his diamond construct, which very much like a decoder ring. And of course, this is where we get names of the components, with, you know, like codons and so forth. And so they've been running with this analogy all this time before they begin to figure out how it really works.
Exactly. And there's a ton of other, like, misnomers in science that are, like, just the weirdest, dumbest thing to name something. And it's only that name because of historical reasons. I'd say this is an example. The one that irks me the most is in cosmology. in the recombination period, when this is the first time atoms were forming, and it's called recombination. It was the first combination to atoms, and they call it recombination, and yet it sticks because the process was first observed in plasma, where it really was a recombination. And they just that now it's confused generations of students in cosmology because you name something based on historical reasons. And I'd say that it's the same thing that's going on here with the misnomer of the genetic code. It's not a literal code. It's only analogous in certain aspects to a code.
No, and I've seen it personally in evolutionary biology. We get that a lot too. I mean, we know that what we're talking about are emergent properties that because of natural selection, these things end up being favored. But the way that we describe the development of feathers in dinosaurs or in other such things is because of their purpose, and that's the language that's used. But that's actually reverse of the reality. They're not doing it because of a purpose. It happened that this was the most successful. So mathematically rolling the dice over many generations with all these, environmental dynamics and everything, you end up with this design, and we sort of paraphrase it as if it was for a purpose, which really doesn't. It anthropomorphizes things and puts a perception of entity or agency where it doesn't belong. But these are just the particulars of our language and how we've come to understand things.
I would agree that it's almost these entire, it's kind of the semantics. It's a loosening of definitions just to apply to some sort of term in science that really is, it's a misnomer. It's loosening the definition too much to where it's not really true in a literal sense. And I agree that you see that all over science, and it causes numerous frustrations for students and teachers alike.
Just remember that science is the place where if a guy gets to name a planet, he discovers a planet and he gets to name it, and that planet has a moon, so he gets to name the moon too. And because it was in the early 2000s when he discovered these, and he's a bit of a nerd, as scientists often are, he names his planet Xena, and he names his moon Galadriel, after the TV show Xena Warrior Princess, as is his right to do. And the scientific community just kind of loses their mind, and they say, no, you can't do that. And one thing leads to another, and they're not even planets anymore. And if you're going to make that not a planet anymore, well, there goes Pluto too. That's what you get for naming it after a TV show.
Yeah. And
meanwhile, in genetics, we have a developmental gene, a very important developmental gene that is it's very important for the development of in embryology. It just you can put the dye trackers on it. You can see how it forms the development of leg buds, how you feather buds, and all of this. And it's just unfortunate that the guy who got to name that gene, his favorite video game became that name. So this, one of the most important genes known in all of embryology, is called Sonic Hedgehog.
Yeah. Yes. And in this instance, in the naming of the designation of this set of rules here as a genetic code, I just would like to point out that, number one, of course, as we've gone over, this was before we actually understood anything about the actual biochemistry of the processes involved that were happening. But two, this was named by someone who's not even in the field. This was a physicist. George Gamow was definitely a polymath genius, but at the same time, he did not have the formal education in biochemistry and biology. He's a physicist. He was a specialist in cosmology and the Big Bang. So it's very problematic from a historical point of view of how we got to this name of genetic code, and seeing it trip up biologists like Richard Dawkins and others is, yeah, I mean, but I'd like to just take them on their word now and just grant them that it is a literal code. And if we just loosen the definition, we ignore all the definitions in all the books, in all the computer science textbooks. We just throw all that out the window. We say, okay, this is a code. We loosen the definition. What then? And what are the consequences? So if we acknowledge the genetic code as a literal code, we have to change the definition to something like, translating a set of rules for translating one form of information into another. That would be what's going on in this genetic code of ours that's now a literal code. So if that's true, then what else counts as a code? And I can think of numerous naturalistic phenomenon that you would necessarily have to concede is a code, to the point where it just gets so absurd that I think the entire word code becomes meaningless. So for a couple examples, light spectra, right? You can look at distant objects in the sky and you can get a spectrum from them. You can get this, it looks like a little barcode, a rainbow barcode. It's got little lines on it, an absorption or an emission spectrum. This is a symbolic representation, right, of the light that's emitted, which is representing the elemental composition of those distant objects like stars or galaxies. So here you have one information, the frequencies of lights that are emitted or absorbed, and it's coding for the periodic table of elements, right? It's coding for the elemental composition. This is, so if you say genetic code is a code, then the light that's coming to us from space, also a code, naturally occurring. You can look at, magnetic striping, right? On the bottom of the ocean, you have all these, ferromagnetic layers of rock that
are you going to have to explain what that is? Because people, my audience, there's an awful lot of young Earth creationists out there.
Yeah,
they don't realize that after several millennia or whatever, then the North Pole becomes the South Pole, and suddenly everything shifts. Your magnets, your compass goes backwards. It's never happened in human history, but we have evidence that it happened prior to human history a number of times.
Yeah, so there's an entire field of paleomagnetism that's like deciphering this code in the rocks, right? You can see these striations in the rocks that will actually be affected based on when the rock was formed, based on the strength and orientation of Earth's magnetic field. So when you decode all of these striations on these rocks, then you can get this symbolic information about Earth's previous magnetic field history through time. So if the genetic code is code, those are code. And let's look at all rocks, right? Because rocks have certain weathering patterns on them. This can be from chemical weathering processes or physical weathering processes, but they symbolically encode the past events that have happened to them. So literally every single rock now has to become a code, because you can decode the features of the rock in order to get information about past events, weathering events. So again,
well, by that logic,
code, all the light in the sky is a code, right? We can even
dendrochronology.
Dendrochronology, also a code. We could even go one step further here and look at chemistry, valence electrons. Well, a valence electron is a certain type of information. And you could say, well, this atom has 6 valence electrons. This atom has 8. Valence just means the outermost shell of electrons. And valence electrons determine the types of chemistry that an atom will do when it interacts with other atoms. So that valence electron, when you have a mediator, just like the transfer RNA is a mediator for the genetic code, is another atom with a certain designated set of valence electrons, just like the transfer RNA has a designated structure attached to a certain amino acid. It's very analogous here, that the number of valence electrons represents information about what type of chemical bond will form. And in this sense, the number of valence electrons is a code encoding information about bond formation. And in this sense, every chemical interaction is participating in this code. And all of chemistry is now code in a literal sense, in the same way that the genetic code is a code. So basically every rock, every tree, all the light from space, every atom interacting chemically with another atom, this is all code now. So pretty much everything is a code if you accept that the genetic code is a literal code. And basically the word code now just is so generalized that it's completely meaningless. It
And
has
then if you, well, we accept everything as a code. Now we're doing stoichiometry to do our own representation of
yeah.
what the chemical construct and possibilities are going to be. And our stoichiometry would be a literal code, but I think more literal than everything you just used as an example.
Yeah.
Because it is a schematic that only represents this
Yeah.
other thing. It doesn't actually do the thing.
And that's an important difference here when talking about the genetic code, is that there is no representation happening beyond the abstract layer that humans are imparting on this. In the same way that I can take a bunch of leaves and I can impart some sort of symbolic meaning to these leaves. That's what we're doing when we describe this genetic code. We make these maps about this maps onto this, maps onto this. But in reality, at the actual level of the biochemistry occurring, there is no representational layer. These are all like physical interactions happening according to the laws of physics, chemistry, and electrostatics. There's no representation. The codon doesn't represent an amino acid. It merely corresponds to one in virtue of the actual structure of transfer RNA.
And your use of leaves as an example just reminded me that we are pattern-seeking creatures, and one of the patterns that we used to use, leaves, were used in fortune telling. You would spread out the tea leaves, which is supposed to be something completely random, but basically what you're doing is a Rorschach test. Whatever you think you see in the leaves, whatever prompts your imagination in these ink blot kind of patterns that you get from these leaves, this is the fortune that you're giving to people, because this is the jacked up way that people think. And we have to use codes and like analogies, for example, in order to understand things that are outside of our normal understanding. And certainly with genetics,
Yeah,
this
I've
is
heard,
not the way we normally think.
I see this happening with like especially religious people, but also people that are prone to spiritualism, or they think that they're receiving coded messages from the universe. This sort of this very egocentric reasoning where everything that's happening around you is happening to you to send you a message from the universe or from God or whatever. Like, you go to a parking lot and your favorite parking space is taken. Well, the universe is sending you a signal because you were rude to your aunt last Tuesday or something. You interpret this however, you are right. We are pattern seeking animals. We see patterns in things where, quite frankly, a lot of the times these patterns are only in our heads. And
Such as the tea leaves.
As I was talking and just describing the absurd outcomes that come about whenever you accept the genetic code as a literal code, and then basically accepting everything as a code, I could already hear some of the creationists saying, "Wow, everything is a code. It had to be coded by God. He had to do everything." And it's like, at this point, I mean, like, I don't even think that they're capable of recognizing the absurdity in their own position sometimes.
And my thought is, if God really did write everything as a code, the tree rings, the zircon formations, just everything is a code, you would think that he would have written the Bible a hell of a lot better than he did.
Yeah, maybe he would have written it in tree leaves. I don't know.
Yeah, so you have all this super genius throughout science, and then you have this book of fables filled with utter ineptitude.
Yeah.
Oh, but that's code too, because you just take this word and when you take this word to mean this other thing instead of this thing, except when it says that other thing, because then it means that. But now it means this. And when you need it to, it means this. And if you do that, well, then you can make it say anything you want.
And I would point out too that between the years, right, where we first elicited like the structure of DNA, and George Gamow came out with his diamond code, and the years when we eventually did figure out what was going on biochemically, there were a plethora of different hypotheses out there about what this code could be. And none of them got it right. And people were immensely disappointed when we finally figured out what it actually is, because they were like, wait, That's it? That's not elegant. We were coming up with these amazing, intricate codes for how to get DNA nucleobases into amino acids and proteins. And they came up with some really elegant stuff that of like, you know, how they can get the grammar, how they could incorporate commas and all of this information necessary for life into this code. And then when they finally figured it out, they were like, well, we were all wrong. And this is like this is disappointing compared to the actual codes that we were coming up with our minds. Like that was the actual historical development in molecular biology.
I remember the computer models that were showing how natural selection is actually capable of producing, because everything is emergent from the molecular level up. The numbers are going to be staggering, and so when we think about how many rods or cones are in the eye, people brag about how complex that is. Well, it's not really that it's complex. It's just that we're talking about molecules. There's going to be a fuck ton of them in anything. It's just the nature of things. So it's not necessarily that it's complex in that way. And when you've got something that is capable of repeating stuff, well, then it's going to repeat stuff. And so you're going to have a lot of stuff. And so it's not really complex in that way. There's ways of simplifying all of this. But then, as you say, we come up with these elegant explanations, and then we start elaborating on where we think it's going to go. And then when we see what it really is, oh.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the exact arc of history in the development of the so-called genetic code. So there are definitely, you could make certain analogies for analogous features, but in terms of interpreting it as a literal code, you have to change the definition. You have to loosen it to the point of absurd meaninglessness. And it just becomes, an exercise in futility to try to just apply this designation of code to literally all of chemistry, rock, space, everything.
Thank you, Grayson, for making clear, at least to me, if not to the people who just refuse to understand this, or maybe are incapable of understanding this, that clearly DNA is not a code. These are not replacements for letters. It's not a language. And DNA definitely did not come from a mind.
Yeah, absolutely not. And examples like we could even talk about, chemical signaling in single cellular organisms. That came about through evolution. And that is much, much easier to see the elements of code in there, like communication between one organism and another through just these chemical signals. That's a lot easier to wrap your head around and think of that as a code. And that clearly evolved. So even just going back to the first and just granting them this designation of code that makes no sense, is absurd, and just violates the definition of the words involved. Even if we grant them that, it could still evolve. And we've seen examples of these codes evolving in labs, in recent history, in deep past. We have the evidence. Evolution is capable of producing these immensely complicated systems of communication through all kinds of intermediaries. So on every single level, this argument that DNA is a code and therefore had a coder fails on every level.
I'm going to put down the link to your channel, Based Theory. Check out Grayson's work, everybody. Thank you so much for being on.
Thanks for having me.